Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to the Infinite Way, where spirituality meets humanity. And my name is Dr. Enolia Foti, and I'm here with Litmus A. Freeman. This is part 4 of Litmus visiting us again, and we are going to have a conversation about higher learning, a conversation about the trivium and quadrivium. And if you're not familiar with those terms, stay with us because you will be by the time we finish. So, welcome, Litmus. How are you?
Hey, Dr. Nolia, it's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm very, 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 very good.
I'm so glad you're doing well. We're happy to have you back. And we're here to talk about something near and dear to, I believe, both of our hearts, the trivium and quadrivium. And I
Yes.
guess we can start off with defining that. Do you want to take the pass at it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I love this stuff. I'm just making a note here, Project Freeman, because when we were talking about our common interests,
Yes.
of which there are many, yeah, the Triv and Quadriv came up. Um, And I've been really looking forward to this discussion, because it's not very often you meet someone else who even knows this stuff exists, never mind knows a bit about it and how to use it. So
Yeah.
that's nice to start with. So yeah, I think I was saying to you yesterday, you're the sort of person I would love to meet at a dinner party, and we could get into some
I'd
we
have
could
these
get
deep conversations that just like take you off into another land, a whole leap octave forward into the space and time continuum of where we like to have these discussions.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So we're not going to be talking about the weather today, guys. Okay. We're going to get into some deep shit. But yeah, just to get the ball rolling, I was thinking about I think the first hour, this is the fourth of our chats now, right?
Correct.
And on the first one, of course, we were talking about Project Freeman. Now, that's something I kicked off like in the Gregorian 2008-ish, around that time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which I now know is when Pluto went into Capricorn. Pluto is now going into Aquarius, so that's great, guys, because that means more freedom and individuality and expressing our uniqueness in the world and all that kind of stuff. So that's good. So it's kind of a new era, but it's a good time to be talking about this stuff because one of the ways we can free ourselves, of course, is by more knowledge, experience, and therefore wisdom, so that we don't get fooled again, as the Who famously sang. Because the new boss is the same as the old boss, right? So don't get
Right.
fooled again. So yeah, when I did Project Free, man, you and I were both in our other life, in our corporate days, project managers, right? That's another thing
Yes.
we have in
Correct.
common. Right, and you may remember. So when I started to investigate this free man stuff and how do we get free and how does the system work and all of that, I set up a project, to do it. And I had a project plan and objectives and a mission statement and the whole thing, and a Gantt chart and everything.
Yes, yes, it sounds familiar.
Yeah, yeah, right. And that's all on the website. But I didn't know anything about the trivium and the quadrivium at that time. Um, and it's something I came across about 4 or 5 years after I started my project. I was at a festival and a couple of guys there were doing a presentation about the trivium and quadrivium. And when they were going through the trivium, so let's just tell people what this thing is to
This
start with.
is, yes.
So it's basically been handed down to us from ancient Greece, um, where really, if you wanted to be an active, you know, working citizen in society in Greece, you really had to know the trivium and the quadrivium, because
Right.
particularly the trivium is classically known as grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So what that is really is basically it's research and analysis. It's collecting the grammar is collecting all the data about something. And then, of course, the logic is using your rational mind to actually analyze all of that data, all the grammar, to start to see some patterns emerging, to come to some conclusions, and to develop some hypotheses. Yeah. So, and then you can share that with people. You can debate it, and there will be then some rhetoric. So the output of all of that analysis gives you some, and we all know what a rhetorical question is. It's kind of a question that you ask that you already know the answer to, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah. And you know that because you've already looked at the grammar and done the logic, and you got to the rhetorical answer. So yeah, I mean, it's what the Trivium teaches us is not what to think, like the Matrix wants to tell us what to think. But what the Trivium does is tell you how to think. And that's the main difference for me, right? So it's not, it's educating someone like how to come up with their own conclusions from their own research, their own analysis, their own logic, their own analysis. So it's not, just watching what someone else says online and regurgitating what they say. It's actually doing some, it's understanding, because you have to do the work. You have to study the grammar to really get to the rhetoric, through the logic.
Yes.
So,
And can I interject in that also
of
too?
course, yeah.
The fact that we, because I've also been studying it from the linguist point of view, right?
Okay.
So we're talking about that grammar. We're really talking about the mechanisms of how we communicate and the meaning of the words that we use to communicate. Because we
Right.
take this for granted, right? And we go, well, the meaning of the words are this, this, and this. Well, where did those words come from? How did they end
Yeah.
up in our language? Were
Yeah.
they borrowed from another language? And
Yeah.
if they were borrowed from another language and out of context, why did we adapt the meaning of those words when we know good and well it's out of context of our own grammatical understanding and our own?
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So really taking, and we're not talking word etymology, okay? Word etymology is, yes, we understand the meaning of the word, but we're really talking about the origins of the grammar and where they were borrowed from and what language they came from, because all of our words did not necessarily start off in English or start off
No.
in British English, whatever the case may be, whatever location that we're at. And so really understanding what we're trying to communicate, the words that we choose to use to make that communication so that the logic makes sense. And so as we really dig down into the logic and breaking apart the different types of logic that there are, when we express that rhetoric, that we just have a true fine-tuned understanding of what we're expressing and that it's meaningful and that it aligns with what we're trying to, the point that we're trying to make too.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
if that's just an add-on.
No, yeah, yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because obviously within CPN recently, we've had this talk about a possible roundtable about words and wordplay and all that Laurel Erica stuff we've been looking at. Yeah, and it is, as you know, I think it's very important that we do understand the origins and etymology. And I have to say that I know what you're saying, but I have to say the etymology online dictionary that I use, it tells you the meaning, but it does also tell you the origin and which language it comes from and all of that. So that's cool. And that's what, as you say, we need to understand the original meaning. And why is it being distorted and taken out of context? I mean, a great example of that is, for me, that's just come to mind, is anarchy. Okay. Now, if we look at the true meaning, and it's from Greek, right?
Right.
Anarchia. Anarchy means without archons, right? And the archons were the magistrates of Greece who decided the rules and laid down the sort of regulations. So when we say anarchy, what we're talking about is there is no ruler sitting above us telling us what to do, and therefore we are all equal. But for us all to be all equal, we all have to understand, basic, decent human principles that we can all agree on about how we want to live together. So it's not about not having any rules. It's about not having any rulers, and there's a guy online, Matt Passio, who's very hot on this, and he makes this point very strongly because he gets quite angry about he tends to get angry about a lot of things, Matt. But I like the knowledge he covers. So yeah, it's really important. So I think that's a good example. If you ask most people in the street what does anarchy mean, they'd probably imagine riots and people smashing windows and like unruly behavior. And of course, it doesn't mean that at all, but that's the way the modern media have portrayed it to be. So that certainly, if we took Britain as an example, middle class England would watching the TV news at 9 p.m. or whatever, they would be shown pictures of rioters, in some demonstration and say, oh, look, these anarchists, and they associate that behavior with anarchy. And of course, that's not what it means at all. It's all it means is we're all equal. So
Right.
if you believe in anarchy, you don't believe in supremacy of any one race or creed or culture or religion or anything above any other. So maybe that's a good example of what you're talking about, because the good thing with the Trivium is it really does make you do that work. So that you get when the conclusion you get to, as you say, you could, if we met at a dinner party and you said, "Oh, I believe this about this certain thing," you could explain why you came to that conclusion through all the grammar and the logic that you did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny too because I was talking to somebody and they were teasing me saying, "Oh, you're from America, you can't speak. You don't really know what English is." And I laugh because I actually do understand the difference between the British English and the American English in the respect that while both of our Englishes developed, what basically happened is that British English had an elite English. And that elite English, instead of allowing the locals to be able to break down their English in any respect that they wanted the country to all aspire to one English, that elite English. So therefore, you were expected to learn the elite English. You were expected to actively participate in the elite English. And then it was not encouraged to have the local dialogues where you broke off that English into your local dialogue and had your own flavor of English. Whereas in
Mhm.
America, what happened is that English was introduced and it wasn't expressed that you have to have and aspire to one English. So as English traveled and it went into its own locales, like Boston English is Harvard Yard, and then down in the South, y'all maybe, and the local flavor and flair, and everybody knows that Louisiana is different from even the Southern English, and then California is different from the New York English. And so every locale can have their own English, and it was not frowned upon that we all have to aspire to one standard of English. So
Yeah.
that's between the two. And typically, I could turn around and come back and say, well, you can tease me all you want, but here's the understanding of that. And we should know this. We should understand that this is the differences between the English that's used or the grammar that was adopted by the countries and their perspectives on it.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, whatever the so-called elite of England may have wanted to happen, of course, there are loads and loads of different local dialects
Of
and
course there is.
idiomas all over the island of Great Britain.
Yes.
So it is very like what you're saying in the States. But yeah, I mean, it's not long ago that the BBC, for example, hello, this is the BBC from London. And if you were on the BBC, that's how you had to talk, you know. And it's only in the last, I don't know, 20 years maybe that they've actually been encouraging like local dialect, you know, newsreaders and like Cymraeg newsreaders and you know people
Yeah,
from Manchester on the doing the weather and whatever, you know. So you do now have that richness of different dialects,
dialect.
but of course you didn't back then. And yeah, and the things like institutions like the BBC with a big part of keeping that sort of snobbery, if you like, with the language there, you know.
Yes.
So yeah, and it's interesting what you say about America because as far as I understand it, American English is actually closer to the original Old English that was exported at that time to the colonies, you know, what later became America.
Right.
Um, and then the language carried on developing in Britain into what is now modern English. But actually, the way some of the American isms, if you like, in English are actually closer to what English used to be because it was exported at that time and then it developed separately, you know. But
Mhm.
yeah, as you say, I mean, English is a mongrel language, right? It's basically I think 40% of the verbs of English are German,
Mhm.
and about
Yeah, that's correct.
almost 60% are then from the Norman French conquest.
Mhm.
And then there's a bit of Norwegian thrown in there, like the days of the week, for example, after the Norse gods. So yeah,
And
you've
a
got
bit
a
of
bit of
Celtic
everything,
in
you
there.
know.
A bit of
And there's a
Celtic
load of
in there.
Latin and yeah. Sorry, I missed what you said there.
Celtic also.
Yeah, yeah, Celtic and Latin and all sorts. It's a big hodgepodge, you know. So
Right.
we really do have to, as you say, look at the where did that term come from and what does it really mean? Yeah. And so we're meaning what we're saying and we're saying what we mean, right? Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, I didn't realize at the time, but I actually kind of set Project Freeman up very much like a Trivium exercise, you know. I didn't know it then, but when I looked at what I'd done, if you look at the way you would actually do the initial research part phase of a project, you know, that's very much Trivium, right? So
Right.
you collect all the data, then you analyze it, and then you come to some conclusions. So yeah, if you look at part one of Project Freeman, that's pretty much what I've done. Phase one is called evaluation and collecting all the data and looking at the analyzing the hypothesis. And phase two is kind of the logic of that and what strategy does that suggest. And then, you know, phase three is actually implementing the rhetoric, if you like, you know, implementing the conclusions you come to. So yeah, I mean, from then on, I developed an interest in the Trivium and then later the Quadrivium. But yeah, back in I think 2012 probably I first came across it. So maybe for
Mhm.
you it's been longer, I don't know, but well, you tell
No, it
me.
definitely wasn't longer. What I realized is that I had pieces to everything. I came from it from a different perspective. I looked at it in terms of the mystery schools and what the mystery schools were actually teaching. And so I understood that the initiates had to have a base level of knowledge in order to even be looked at. And I didn't realize at the time it was called the Trivium, right? So they had to have the grammar, rhetoric, and logic so that they could, in essence, read texts and see the meaning beyond the text by truly grasping the grammar and the logic that led to the conclusions. And then, you know, almost like read between the lines of the text that they were given. And this was part of their foundation because if they were capable of doing that, then they would be adopted as an initiate to be able to
Okay.
study and lay the straight foundation of the quadrivium. And then when you look at this, we're really talking about the basic liberal arts topics, right? So we're talking about, you know, the rhetoric, the grammar, the logic, and then if they successfully participated in those pieces, then they could look at the quadrivium, which was the arithmetic, the geometry, the astronomy, and the music, you know,
Yeah.
and we understand that those all lay the foundation for the higher level metaphysical connections and thinking and topics that we love to traverse, like physics and quantum theory, quantum mechanics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I really took it from that perspective and understanding mysticism also, and not necessarily saying, okay, this is the trivium and quadrivium. And
Yeah,
so,
okay.
yeah. And so I didn't
Yeah.
know what it was called until somebody formalized it for me. It was like, oh, okay, that's what I've been that's what I've been playing with this whole time. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So it's interesting. We came at it from different starting points, but we went through a similar process where we were kind of looking at studying it, but without really knowing what it was,
Right.
formally like classed as. Yeah, yeah. And it's
Right.
interesting you talk about mystery schools because I've always had a fascination with those too.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, you're right. I mean, the first mystery schools, I mean, even if we took Freemasonry, it was set up with a very good intention originally, just to preserve the secret, well, what had to become secret knowledge, um, to protect the knowledge through the Dark Ages. And maybe this is a good time just to mention this chart
Absolutely.
behind me.
Yeah.
Now I know it's a bit blurry, and I'm not expecting you to be able to see the details, but this is the Great Year cycle of consciousness, which was featured in my first session with for CPN recently, the Great Year and the Universal Celestial Calendar. So it's an anti-clockwise cycle, like most things are. And at the top is the peak of the Golden Age, and at the bottom is the bottom, the depths of the Iron Age, the Kali Yuga, the famous Kali Yuga, and this the age of ignorance. Now we have to be very careful with anything that comes from the Kali Yuga because we have to put a warning stamp on it because it's probably going to have been corrupted and confused in some way. Um, but if we go back before the Kali Yuga, so we're here now. We're still very low in the cycle. But if we go back to the other, so we're ascending in consciousness, but we're quite near the bottom. And if we look back to the other side when they were coming down in consciousness from the golden age, if we look at Greece, classical antiquity Greece starts back in the Bronze Age before the Kali Yuga. But it does carry on into Kali Yuga and then, of course, merges into the Roman period, which was all Kali Yuga.
Hmm.
So I think it's really interesting now that where we are now in the Bronze Age ascending, but in the early years of the Bronze Age ascending, we're now level with where the ancient Greece was when they were descending in consciousness. So I think it's interesting that a lot of us are waking up to wanting to rediscover things from that period, and studying ancient Greek philosophy and mythology and all of that stuff, and things like this, the Trivium and Quadrivium coming back. So
Yes.
I think that's really interesting for me because of my fascination with this cycle, that it's this time that we're getting back into this stuff, and that's really cool.
So if you could set the tone a little bit more on understanding the golden age between the dark ages, just so that our audience understands when you're talking about the Kali Yuga ages and the fact that that actual golden age versus the dark ages is how consciousness actually rose and how it sank. Like, I think that you need to really set the tone so that people can really understand what you're talking about when you say that we're here at the base.
Okay, okay. Yeah, sure. Good point. Okay, so this is a 24,000 year cycle.
Right.
All right, and the peak of the cycle, the peak of the golden age, when human consciousness is at its maximum. We use all of our brain, all of our DNA is activated. This is the theory. We're very tall. We live for many, many, many years, longer than we do now. We don't even know if we have physical bodies in that time. We're very telepathic. Our third eye is open. We've got cosmic consciousness. We're one with God. It's that kind of consciousness, okay? Now, we're obviously a long way from that. at the moment. But at all times of this cycle, there are people who have that consciousness, even through the bottom. But the peak of that was 11,500 BC or BCE, okay, in the Gregorian system. And the bottom of the cycle, the bottom of the age of ignorance, the lowest vibration would be 500 AD, okay? So it's 12,000 years descending and 12,000 years ascending.
Thank you.
And now we're only 1,500 years from the bottom, from 500 AD, okay? And we're only like 300 years or so into the Bronze Age ascending. So the Kali Yuga really only ended in 1900, all right? So we're only just over 100 years fully out of Kali Yuga. So there's still a lot of Kali Yuga stuff hanging around. And I always say it's like the hangover the morning after the big party, you know? It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of where we are. So just to put it in context, yeah, we're now remembering, rediscovering, getting back into stuff that was around in our consciousness at this equivalent time, but in the descending part of the cycle. Okay, right.
Right. So
And
things
by doing
create.
that, that's how we raise our consciousness, how we wake up and remember. That's one of the ways we do it. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's build. Let's take our audience on a journey and let's build a little bit more. So here it is. We have the trivium. We have the basis. We have this methodology by which we do our homework, we do the research, we communicate, we sit down with the logic, and we extrapolate what needed to be understood within that logic, and then we communicate it out. And when you have the capability and the understanding of doing this, which, by the way, I kind of want to mention that many people don't, because they don't do the homework. When we talk about doing the homework, when you're sitting there listening to a speech and somebody telling you the sky is gray, and you know good and well it's blue, that means take what the words have been stated or the facts, go down, apply logic, do your homework, do the research, understand the logic that no, the sky is blue. It is not gray. Okay? This is what we mean. Many of us, when we do not know information, okay, and information is provided to us, and we're fascinated by the information, a lot of people will idolize that person and take it for granted that that's the way it is. Okay?
Yeah.
That's not good. And then we deify them and put them on this pedestal because, oh, well, they know. They said they know. They sounded like they know. It felt right. But that doesn't mean it is right, right?
No.
Let's take a perfect example of this, right? Because I just finished doing this, right? Terrence Howard basically made this big claim about mathematics, right? And basically says 1 times 1 is not 1. 1 times 1, is 2.
And sorry, who is Terrence Howard again? I know he's an actor,
He's
right?
a
I think you
famous
said, but
actor, believe it or not. He's a famous actor, but he has his and I don't want to say hobby. He has his focus in physics and mathematics and quantum theory and wave theory. Okay, this is his love outside of what he does. Okay, and I shared some of this information with you. All right.
Yeah, you did. That's right. Yeah.
So he just made a huge announcement at Oxford regarding his findings. And, so I listened to it. I was impressed by it. And it definitely intrigued me. And so what he shared was, okay, don't take my word for granted. Go do the work. Here's who I read. And I grabbed a handful of the people. So what I basically did is I read his book. I read some of the people that he researched by. But I was actually reading a particular mathematics book by Edmund Husserl. Okay. And Edmund Husserl did the philosophy of arithmetic. And the philosophy of arithmetic has its supplementals and everything, but it's really arithmetic applied, but linguistics applied to arithmetic. That basically
Okay.
says, let's break down the terminology used and the arguments that they were going through in the early 1900s of why we should use these particular words, including multiplicative, the word multiply. So we're breaking down, does multiply means I'm multiplying a concept or a representative, a symbol, okay? And then if you take a little bit of physics on top of this, which is for every action, there's a reaction, a symbol or a representation or a concept is an energy. It's a physical thing that's there. It doesn't disappear. It stays. So I'm reading Edmund Husserl, who basically makes the argument that everything in the mathematics from the number 2 above is fine, but we need to have more discussion about zeros and ones. And then when you're talking about the zeros and ones and the verse and the way that he uses the terminology of whether they're a symbol, they represent a symbol, or whether they represent a concept in order to have an output of a group, a grouping as a result, okay? They were having the same argument in the early 1900s. And it was interesting that Edmund Husserl did not agree with what became the mainstream and what he called it lazy. And he was like, it's easy to say that. So here it was, for me, that validated the concepts of what Terrence Howard was trying to present based on my own research, based on my own deep dive in and factual information. But this is what we're talking about. This is very important. A claim is made, a statement is made. We do our homework, we do our research, we find our findings, and we draw our conclusions.
Yeah. So this is probably a good point to bring in logical fallacies, yeah?
Yes.
So when we, because you mentioned one of them right there. So when we're talking about doing the logic part, the second part of the 3, you know, we need to include in there the logical fallacies. And I think there are many, but I certainly know of about 40 main logical fallacies, and there are probably more. But if you do a little bit of research on the web, you'll find the list of logical fallacies, and then I think this is really important that everyone reads this list of logical fallacies and understands how they're used, because you will see this every day everywhere in every modern Western media, particularly, but any form of media where they're trying to brainwash you or condition you, they will use loads and loads of logical fallacies. So you mentioned there, like the call to authority or the call to celebrity. So because that's one of the fallacies. So because I'm a well-respected, you know, I'm Isaac Newton, right? So I say that the precession of the equinoxes that results in this cycle of consciousness is due to the wobble of the earth, due to the pull of the sun and the moon. Now that 200 or 300 years later, that becomes like, oh, well, this is how it actually works. No, it's not. It's a theory. That's a theory that's never been proven, but it's the currently accepted theory by the mainstream in physics and maths. So that's what everyone says it is. But there are other theories that cause this cycle. But because Isaac Newton said, this is the one that I think is right, everyone thinks that's right because he's got that celebrity and that authority. But that is a logical fallacy. It doesn't mean, just because he's right about lots of other things, it doesn't mean necessarily he's right about this thing. So we always have to be careful with that. And I would just like to mention the other, probably number 1 in the list of logical fallacies is what they call ad hominem, right? Is the attack on the person saying the thing. So you'll see, and I mean, COVID was a great example of all of these logical fallacies, right?
Perfect example.
They were rolled out every night on the news by the politicians and stuff. And of course, if somebody said something against the official narrative, one of the classic things they would do is attack the person, not what he's saying or she's saying.
But the person
They
individually.
yeah, they would try to ridicule the individual to undermine their argument, but that is a logical fallacy, and it whoever they are, even if it's Jeffrey Epstein or Donald Trump or whoever it is, whoever says this thing, just because they may talk bullshit a lot of the time, it doesn't necessarily mean that that thing they're talking about is going to be bullshit, and you have to check out every time what someone says based on the circumstances, right? So I think I would love people who watch this, I would love you all to go away and check out logical fallacies and familiarize yourself with them, because then you cannot have the wool pulled over your eyes and you can use your own logic and not get distracted by ad hominem attacks and calls to celebrity and all these other fallacies that they use all the time. And you can get through that and see the clear picture. Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that.
I think that that's phenomenal. And you know what? Especially when you're sitting back and you're watching, I know it's an election year in the US and I'm not there, so I don't get the feel for any of it, but they use logical fallacies embedded one on top of the other. Every other statement is a logical fallacy.
Right.
So you really, really have to pull apart. That's why a lot of times you end up coming out of debates totally confused. Totally confused. You're not quite sure which way to go, what direction to understand, or what to believe, because you really heard nothing but logical fallacies.
Right. And of course they do that on purpose
Yes.
because when you're confused, what does confusion lead to? Apathy. So confusion leads to apathy. So you just say, "Oh, I don't really understand this politics stuff. I'm just going to watch the football and have a beer, you know, and
Right.
and pretend everything's great, you know." It's like, so I'm going to go into ignorant bliss. And I mean, I do this. I still do this sometimes, you know. It's nice sometimes to just plug in the matrix and watch some football, right? But at least do it in the full awareness that you are taking a break, you know. And, you know, really, yeah, we end up with a lot of apathy because of these logical fallacies. And then people don't take action on the things they care about. So it undermines the divine feminine and the sacred masculine, you know, doing things about taking action about things you care about. And that's another Mark Passio one, by the way. So yeah, absolutely. They trot these out all the time. And I liked what you said earlier about, you know, the elitism with the language and stuff, because it's a bit like if you go back to England in the past, you'll probably know, I'm sure you know as a linguist, but the official sort of language of the church and the wealthy was Latin, you know, and you had to understand Latin. And they would always speak in Latin, and the common people didn't understand Latin because they didn't speak Latin. So they didn't know what they were on about. So it was only later when they did a translation of the Bible from Greek and Latin into English and printed it via the printing press that normal people could actually understand what the hell they were on about, you know? So, and it's a bit like that now with the news media. They say they're speaking in English, but for all intents and purposes, to most people, they might as well be talking in Greek or Latin because they don't understand what they're on about, you know, because they contradict themselves all the time. So yes, it's very important that we do the work and we do the study and we do educate ourselves on things like this so that we can make reasonable, you know, use critical thinking and come to reasonable conclusions based on facts and not logical fallacies.
And you know, as we're sitting here talking about logical fallacies, the same's going to really, really go for rhetoric, right? In a great respect, right? Because the five main parts of rhetoric, or the five main canons of rhetoric, are really going to be the invention of what you've created to say, the arrangement of how you choose to say it, the style of how you deliver it, the memory, and again, the delivery, you know? So it's just like, again, what are you saying? How are you saying it? How did you arrange it to say it? Is it a convincing argument? Does it appeal to a reader in several ways? Or, you know, is it persuasive? You know, that's when we can go back to Aristotle, and we can go back to Socrates, and we can go back to the fathers, and go to the logos, the ethos, and the pathos, right? Where we can go by,
Like Pythagoras, right?
and Pythagoras, correct.
I like
So
that. I'm making a note. Can you say those three again? I'm going to write that down. The logos.
the logos, the ethos, and the pathos.
Ah, yeah, that's right. I'd forgotten about that. Thanks for reminding me. Oh, logos,
Yeah,
ethos, pathos.
yeah, because all of this, for me, when I started studying this, I actually came across the three arguments, which was Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato were arguing.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, they're arguing their points, and they were doing it in such a way to demonstrate the logos, the ethos, and the pathos.
right.
So, yeah. So
Because the
that does
Greeks loved, yeah, the Greeks loved to present things in dialogues, didn't they, between
always.
learned people. So it's almost like listening to a podcast. You can imagine, you know, they probably are podcasts of this where someone's playing Aristotle, someone's playing Socrates, you know, and can I play Plato, please, you know, and
And
they
the
do
thing
it as
about
it makes it more interesting, right?
it does. And the thing about it is I had to really study it because I didn't get it at first. I'm like, what are they talking about? Why? Because I wasn't familiar with the grammar, right? So then
Right.
we go
Yeah.
back to the trivium, right? You have to familiarize yourself with the grammar. So then that you can understand and apply your own logic to it. And then when it's communicated, you have comprehension of it. And people who don't get what I'm talking about still, or if they don't get what we're talking about, the perfect example is when you had to study Shakespeare in high school, and many people were like, I don't get Shakespeare. Why did you have to do these, thous, those? You know, why can't we just say it the way you have to understand that grammar, that way of communication, the choice of words, you know, that brings it all together to share this rhetoric of meaning and of
Yeah.
logic.
Yeah. And to keep it in the context of the time that it was written in, right? And the
Yes,
arguments it was putting forward. And there's a lot of allegory and reading between the lines in Shakespeare, right? You
yes,
know,
there is.
there's a
There
lot of
is.
mystery school kind of stuff slipped in there.
It's a
You
lot
know,
of it.
there's this whole theory that it was actually maybe Francis Bacon and a group of other people
Exactly.
writing Shakespeare in the name of Shakespeare, right?
In the name of
Yeah.
Shakespeare. And I love that idea because Francis Bacon, I believe, played a huge role. They said that really Shakespeare didn't do any of his work, that it was all Francis Bacon, correct? I believe
Yeah, and
that.
I mean, there's two or three main theories about what Shakespeare really was. There's a great movie actually, starring Reese Ifans. What's it called? I'm gonna have to look that up, but I think it's called Anonymous or something like that. But
Okay.
it's basically Derek Jacobi's in it, and it's one of these movies that's summarizing one of these theories about who actually wrote Shakespeare and how it all came about. Because I do find it hard, to be honest, to believe that one guy did all of that stuff. But who knows? Maybe he did. But I like to explore alternative theories, of course, you know.
Well, that's the trivium part of us, right?
So yeah, and what I love about what you just said as well is really, you know, you were using the trivium to understand the trivium, right? Well, I love that, you know, when it comes full circle. So
When
I'm
it
going to
gets
apply what I've learned about the trivium to really understand the trivium in some detail, you know. Yeah, but that's what we have to do. So can you just for me, I'd forgotten about the logos, the ethos, and the pathos. So the logos is the word, right? The word.
I believe so, and I can actually go to my formal notes.
Okay,
So the
because I think it
logos
might be good to
appeals
share
to
that with
the
people.
yeah, the logos really appeals to the audience reason, the buildup of logical arguments. That's the
Okay,
logos.
okay.
And then the ethos appeals to the speaker's status or authority and, making the audience more likely to trust them,
Okay.
So, and then the pathos appeals to the emotions, trying to make the audience feel angry or sympathetic, for example. So
Okay.
really that's how it boils down to in just plain simple terms.
Got you. Okay. Thank you. That's a good reminder for me because I'd forgotten completely about those. And I must admit, to be honest, I'd kind of forgotten about the five aspects of rhetoric as well that you mentioned. So that was a good reminder for me as well. Um, I when you said about doing this podcast, I thought, oh, maybe I should go and do some more research and refresh my memory about the Trivium, Quadrivium. And then Melvin, my little voice inside, he says, nah, don't worry about that. He says, just have a talk and you'll get it all out between you, it'll be fun. So that's what we're doing, right?
And it's
Cool.
important because if we come from an academic and intellectual perspective and point of view, I don't want to lose the audience in the respect that, oh, well, what do you think you're doing? I mean, we need to apply things like this in our everyday terms. We need to go,
Yeah.
what the heck was that? What did you mean by that?
Mm.
Because then it's palatable. Then, people would potentially want to explore it more. But if you try to come from like a superiority point of view, you lose everyone. Who wants that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, certainly in Britain, the vast majority of the politicians and people that represent the system on TV and stuff like that, they've all been to public school. Well, what we call public school, which is actually private school. It's the opposite of America, where private school is actually private and public is public. But in England, for some reason, they call private school public school. So it's very strange. Um, so they call what you call public school, they call state school, state education.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to be clear to American audience, and when I say public school, um, everything called public is royal under the law. So this is one of the reasons that these are called public schools. It's like a public house, a pub is a royal house. That means that the crown can tax the drink, put a tax on the beer. But public schools are royal schools, okay? They're royal sponsored. And the first two were Oxford and Cambridge. And they were two of the very first corporations created by the Crown in England, okay? Which is very interesting. But of course, all of these guys, they've all been and had this training in these schools. So they know all about the trivium and quadrivium and how to use logical fallacies and all of this stuff. And of course, what they tend to do is use very flowery language and big words and all this kind of thing to make other people feel inferior. And then people don't like to ask questions too much because they don't want to appear to be kind of stupid, And they put people off asking too many questions with the sort of flowery language and big words they use, And I've seen that a lot, But we must never be afraid to ask a question. And the simpler the question, the better, usually, because no one knows everything. No one's got all the answers, and we all need to ask questions, and we can't possibly all know everything. So the only way we're going to know more is by asking someone who knows more about it, right? So yeah, we
And
should never
I
feel
think
stupid.
never, never, never. And I think what you're saying is really, really important, more than what you know, because that's exactly it. Oxford, Cambridge, higher level schools incorporate the Trivium Quadrivium. Out in America, most state schools do not.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Public schools do not. And
Right.
so that's what's actually fundamentally missing in our school system, in the liberal arts system,
Hmm.
is the basis laid out for the Trivium Quadrivium. Is it present? Well, what they've done is they've picked it apart so much that it doesn't make sense. So you can go take a logic class here. You could take a rhetoric class here, because I took them very separately, right?
Right.
And did not put them together. Did not
Right.
understand the underlying the word I want to use is integration of what they mean as a foundation together.
Hmm.
in order to use and in order to deduce, in order to understand, okay, I need this as a basis or a foundation to build on that higher level of thinking. And what in essence has happened is now we've got many, many, many professionals that can't expand their thinking. They can't go beyond their thinking. They think very narrowly because this is what I was taught, this is how it's done, and they don't have that inclination to do the investigation above and beyond where they're at. And so they
Yeah.
operate in the bubble.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying there, because really we're talking about the kind of dumbing down of education, right?
Yes.
And this happened in Britain as well. There used to be actual schools called grammar schools. That's what they were called, grammar schools.
Yes, there were.
And perhaps that's now we know why they were called grammar schools.
Yes, we
You know, I
do.
used to wonder why they were called grammar schools, but I think I can see why now. But at age 11, you would sit an exam called the 11 plus. And if you passed it, you would go to grammar school, which was a higher kind of learning school. And if you failed the 11 plus, you'd go into the comprehensive sort of, system with all the oiks or whatever you want to, so basically they were splitting you into a hierarchy based on whether you pass this test or not. But they don't even have those schools anymore. They got rid of all that whole thing, and there aren't grammar schools anymore. They're just state
They're not
comprehensive
grammar schools
schools.
anymore, but there's still schools of thoughts like I believe the German system, they still do that, where they test you at a certain stage. Let's say you're 11th grade, and then you can either go into higher level learning or you go into woodworking or the supportive services. Okay. But you
Yeah,
don't go into the academia because you don't have the foundation professed for academia and intellectual thinking. So they give you the supportive services, which is woodworking
yeah,
or this or that or the other, that don't
yeah.
require that. So there's still
I,
systems set up for that. And then I find it also interesting that there are other cultures that know that it's missing and they set up their children to learn it. People have you ever thought why people go to Hebrew school or the additional school above and beyond school? Because they're learning trivium and quadrivium. They're learning
yeah,
how to think. They're learning how to approach and assess and use logic and communicate based on the language that is absolutely essential in their culture, right? And
yeah.
so, when little Anne goes to Hebrew school and whatnot above and beyond regular schooling, they're capturing what's missing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think in Germany they call it gymnasium, right? I think
I think
that's
so. I'm not quite sure. I just know that one of my son's friends his parents were really they were really afraid for their son because they were expats and they were about to go back to Germany and their son was behind and they were
right.
academics and they didn't want their son not being included to be academics because that's how they live their lives as academics. And
Yeah.
that's when I was the system was exposed to me.
Yeah. And the other thing that's of interest for me from what you said there as well is this sort of the division between academia and as you say, what are called supportive services. And I never liked that in school, that you know, things that you do with your hands that are actually really useful in everyday life
Oh,
were
very.
sort of seen as a lower class thing, and if you weren't academic, you went into this lower kind of sort of level of things. But of course, they're all the guys who earn all the money because they can actually do things for all the people who are academics, So
Right.
it's we should recognize the importance of trades and crafts people and things that we do with our hands as well as what we do with our brains, and it shouldn't be this hierarchy thing, because I think if you've ever seen Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the
Yeah.
first people on the ship to get off the Earth because it's being demolished are the ones who can make things and do things with their hands and build things and all that kind of thing.
Right.
And I think
But
the last two people in that to be allowed on the ship were the hairdressers and the lawyers.
that's I remember that movie.
Sorry to all the hairdressers and lawyers, but that's not me. That's Douglas Adams. Okay.
But it's a misnomer regarding the tradespeople, because to be a mason, and I'm talking about what we termed as a bricklayer slash mason, was a
Absolutely. Yeah.
highly, highly esteemed job. And why was it
Exactly.
a
Yeah.
highly esteemed job? And why did so many people want to apprentice it? Well, let's talk about that just slightly, in the respect that you had to have a base knowledge of intellect in order to be, I'm going to call it a bricklayer because I don't want to confuse with Freemasonry. I want to talk about masons, bricklayers, right?
Yeah.
You had to have a base knowledge of the Trivium, and so that you could actually learn Quadrivium with bricklaying. And you're going, well, Quadrivium or bricklaying, and we haven't really gotten into that topic. We'll follow that next. But sacred geometry is one of the fundamental bases of bricklaying. And you're saying sacred geometry because of how the buildings are positioned, because of its alignment with the stars and alignment with other buildings, because of the greater picture of fitting it into the geometric alignment that they actually had. And in order to learn about the astronomy and the layout of these particular pieces were all done with these bricklayers. Now, for us to sit there and say that tradespeople, the ones who work with their hands, they're the first to go, shame on us.
Yeah.
Shame on us. And that architecture, bricklaying, the people architectures are designing it, right? And really they just broke that out because the bricklayers and the masons and the senior masons were the ones who were the architects and the designers.
No, absolutely.
And so
And you
here
can,
we are times
yeah.
looking at
And
a
you can,
car.
you're right. And you can see that in the tarot, right? In the tarot cards. I think, is it the Three of Pentacles? I think you've got the architect and the mason and the
Okay.
planner or something. And actually the most kind of senior guy is the one laying the bricks, right? So,
That's right.
oh, just to be clear, when I said first to go on the ship, I was talking about the Hitchhiker's Guide. So they were the most important. The first to go on the ship were the most important. Okay. Because the story with that is that the Earth's getting demolished and they're going to ship everyone off to another planet. So, like,
Right.
who are the most useful people we want to get on the ship first? So they're all the bricklayers and the carpenters and the people who can make things, right? And the lawyers were the last ones that they let on if there's any room left, It's like, because we probably don't need lawyers when we get to this new planet. We probably need people who can build things, Maybe in 300 years' time, we'll have a dispute between some people and then we might need a lawyer, So, but yeah, you're right. And I'm glad you brought up masonry because, of course, all of those amazing buildings that are still with us today, which, I mean, you've only got to walk into one of those buildings and feel the energy of that space, and it's often in the golden section ratios, the space is designed and is, as you say, all sacred geometry in there. And you can feel it, you can feel the quadrivium now. Now you know what it is. You can feel it when you go into a beautiful cathedral or something, and there's so much symbolism and stuff in there. So yeah, maybe we should talk more now about the quadrivium. Yeah.
Let's segue right into that. So the quadrivium are the four remaining really liberal arts subjects, really arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And when we talk about this, really what we're doing is we're building on top of our understanding of the grammar, rhetoric, and logic, or grammar, logic, and rhetoric, if I say it in the proper order, of foundational understanding, so that we can build on top and then extrapolate the understandings, the deeper understandings of music and its tonality and where octaves reside. And those octaves can be applied to astronomy and astrology. Those octaves can be applied to mathematics. Those octaves can be applied to so many different layers in physics and how we decide to separate the substances that we're calling our minerals, it just for me, it's like the medicine wheel. It builds, 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 one on
Yeah.
top of the other, so that you have a strong enough foundation to be able to take that leap of orbit forward more for the things that are unknown
Right,
to man.
exactly. So that we can use that, what we do know, to figure out what we don't know, right?
Don't know.
And
Right.
that's how we develop and raise our consciousness, So
Exactly.
yeah, I mean, you talked about the foundation, so maybe let's just run through for everyone how the quadrivium works.
Go ahead.
So arithmetic, the first part. So that's about number. So that's the study of numbers and how numbers work. Yeah, okay. And we've all done arithmetic in school. So it's adding up and multiplying and taking away and dividing and all that kind of stuff. And then if we then take that number and we apply it to space, we get geometry. So geometry is the study of the number in space, in 3D space. So how do these right angle triangles work, and all of that Pythagorean stuff, all that geometric stuff is really talking about number in space. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And then if we think about time, we got space and time. And if we think about number in time, of course, that's music, right? So 4 beats to a bar or 3/4 time or whatever. We're talking about notes coming on a time frame. And we can have different beats per minute, so we can have faster tempos and slower tempos, but really all we're talking about there is multiplications and numbers in time. And then we get to the fourth one, which is called astronomy. I would now call it astronomology, of course, not astronomy,
Yes.
but because the astrology also exhibits this. But now we're talking about number in space and time. So we start off with arithmetic, which is number. We apply it to space, that's geometry. We apply it to music, which is time. And then astronomy is time and space. So then we're really looking at, light years of distance to stars far away. And we're talking about cycles and how they work. And that's all the astronomy and astrology stuff comes in. So I hope that sort of gives people an idea for how, when we're talking about the trivium, we're a lot more talking about words. There are number data in there, but it's really more about words. Whereas when we're talking about the quadrivium, it's really much more about number. So we got the words and the numbers. So I hope then it starts to make sense, yeah?
Yes, and then once you master the words, you can deep dive into any aspect that you want to. Really, that's what it's saying, is take the time to master the words. So for example, if you're a business person and you're going into a manufacturing facility, take the time to understand how the language of the engineers between one another is going to get their points across and their logic across, so that you can then introduce that business language into, knowing that you want to change what they're doing from an engineering to a business perspective so that you can get to a customer. But if you can't do the transition between the two languages, you're lost. And that's why a lot of people can't talk to IT people. They get lost when IT people talk about megabytes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Business people can't talk to engineers. Engineers are lost when it comes to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Yeah. We have to take the time to learn the language. And once we learn the language, we understand the logic and we understand the output from the logic. And then we can apply our own logic or our own grammar or transference or bridging of the grammar to the language so that others can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, every discipline has its own language, right? So if we take legal law and legal stuff, and then that brings us back to Freeman stuff, because we ordinary people didn't know that when they said this word, they meant this other meaning that we didn't know about because it was from Norman French in a law book or something. It was in legalese, not in English, you know, but it
Right.
looks and sounds like English, but it has a different meaning. So absolutely, yeah.
You
Um,
know,
but it's
it's funny.
really, yeah,
Okay.
go on.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say it reminds me of when I read the Keys of Enoch, right? Which is
The keys of,
the Keys of Enoch, which
oh,
is
Keys of Enoch, yeah.
yes, which is a heavy duty read, right?
Okay,
And what I had to do is I had to read the glossary first.
yeah.
And why did I read the glossary first and take the time for like a month just doing introducing myself to the words so that when I read, I could understand that there was a double or triple or quadruple meaning behind what was being expressed. I'm familiar with the word. I could go back, look up the word, and then see the multiple ways that the meaning has an impact on that statement or the sentence that was actually expressed in the book.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you mentioned glossary because I do just want to remind people that if you go to projectfreeman.com and go to part one, Free the Body, you'll see right at the top of the page, it says glossary. And if you click there, you'll get a whole load of pages with a glossary and it'll tell you what these words that they use really mean, you know, so you can understand it. So yeah, it's a good point. With everything we study, we have to understand the language. And it's a
The
bit like,
language.
yeah, it's a bit like actually understanding the foundation of the language and how the language is structured and all the grammar and the phonetics and the dialects and the different way things are pronounced, rather than learning phrases from a phrase book, you know?
Right.
You
But I'm
know,
going to
if you're
pause
just
you
going to
right there.
visit, yeah.
I'm going to pause you because you're if they didn't see the part one of this podcast, then you just lost your audience. So please tell them just a brief synopsis of Project Freeman and why you're saying what you're saying.
Ah, okay, yeah, sorry, okay. Yeah, so if you haven't seen part one, thank you, Anolia. Project Freeman basically is a project that I did to understand the system and how it works, um, in order to stop uh, being complicit in government war crimes, basically. So it was a way to understand the system to withdraw my tax money so that the taxes weren't used for killing people abroad in wars. And to do that, I had to study the law and the media and the money system and how the whole thing works, basically how the matrix works. Um, so if you go to projectfreeman.com and look at part one, Free the Body, you'll find all of this data there that I did, very much in the way of the Trivium, which basically explains how the matrix, how the system works and how it controls you and kind of makes you a debt slave or a tax slave, basically. But more importantly, how you can break free of that and by understanding how it works, how you can become master of it rather than slave to it. So that's basically what it's about.
So because what you were saying is very powerful, the fact that you had the glossary of terms so that people can understand and break down, because this is why we get trapped in these frameworks and these systems, is because we don't understand it. We don't understand where to begin to break it down. We don't understand how it flows, what it flows, the double meanings behind it, how to catch it, and the different perspectives that we can view from it, unless we
Yeah.
do that. And so the work
Yeah.
that you did is extremely important for people to understand and who may want to go down that path.
Yeah. And of course, you know, one of the ways people maintain their status or their income once they're in a discipline, the way we do that is by using all these fancy words and making other people think that they don't understand it and we do, and they need us, they need to pay us to do that thing because they don't understand it. But actually, if you kind of use some other words that people did understand, you know, maybe they wouldn't need you so much. So, so you know, I mean, law is the best example of that because it's completely a different language, basically, that sounds like English. But in any discipline, there are all these big terms and fancy words that people generally don't understand because they haven't been exposed to it. And I think maybe we can all learn something about getting away from just carrying on using these terms that we've been told, because a lot of them just don't make sense. And if my example of this is astronomy, so. And even if we just think of we've been talking about wordplay recently, and we're talking about the day. If we think of the day, we talk about waking up in the morning, in the afternoon. But if we actually look at what those words mean and what we're saying, we don't want to use them anymore. So we want to use the rising and the setting instead, and people can understand that. But I think that's, we can all do that. We can all start to use more terms which are more clear rather than, equinox is a good example. Equinox equal night in Latin. Well, that's the equinox isn't just about equal night, it's about lots of other things. And it's about the angle of the earth to the sun and all sorts of things. But if you just thought it was about the equal night, it wouldn't really tell you a lot. So we don't have to keep using those terms, just because everyone's used them up to now, because a lot of them come from Kali Yuga, and they're wrong.
And they're wrong. And I really would love for you to expand on why you call astronomy and astrology astronomology. Okay. And why it was divided, to give an example of the quadrivium. Okay.
Yeah,
because this
yeah.
is what happens. We have two areas that were very important that shouldn't have been expressed with the way that they're expressed today, which why people are confused by them. Okay. The fact that they're two separate areas. And this is why I loved your class. This is why I was so drawn to your class and the work that you did when you brought it all together. So do you want to
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, they would never used to be a thing called astronomy. It was all called astrology. And astrology means a telling of the celestial bodies, basically, which can be planets, stars, or constellations, or whatever. And it was the science of those things, but also the physics and the metaphysics, But interestingly, at the end of Kali Yuga, which is between sort of the coming out of Kali Yuga is between 1600 and 1900 CE, or what we used to call AD. Okay, so but in that time, that was kind of the age of reason, where a lot of these people like Newton and stuff came out. And what a lot of people don't know about people like Newton is they were into astrology and metaphysical things as well. But they're mostly well known for the more left brain scientific data driven stuff that they did and about physical laws. So they kind of they created a new discipline called astronomy, which was very fact and number and science based, without any of the metaphysical stuff in there. And that was left with astrology, and you had this new thing called astronomy come out. But actually, to get the full picture of what's going on in space and time, as we were talking, the study of astronomy is number in space and time. But you need to put astrology back in there, because otherwise you've only got the physics without the metaphysics. And the fact that there is a thing called metaphysics that exists tells you that it needs to be studied as well. Right. So yeah, I just came up with astronomology because it's putting astronomy and astrology back together where they should be. Bringing it all back home, and singing the song with all the verses in there. Because. Otherwise, if we only study astronomy, we're gonna exercise our left brain, and we're gonna put our energy into our left brain, and we're going to become left brain biased, and then we're going to become masculine biased, patriarchally biased, and logic biased, and all of that stuff. And if we only look at astrology, we're typically going to exercise the right hand side of our brain. And we're going to become too dominant, maybe more feminine kind of thing, and more creative and artistic orientated. But then we're going to miss all the left brain stuff. So we really need. I think John Lennon, one of his songs, said that the women, woman is the other half of the sky, you know, and you need the masculine and the feminine to have the full sky. You can't have half a sky, you know. So
Right.
this is, you know, it's for the other half of the sky. So let's bring it back together where it belongs. And that's why I'm proposing that with the quadrivium, we don't call it astronomy, we call it astronomology.
Right, right. And you know, I
So
think that this is
yeah,
really, really important. And the reason that I think this is important is that very, very decisively were things torn apart because this keeps an individual ignorant because they only have half the equation. So
yeah,
if you only have theory and you don't have practice, if you only have astronomy but you don't have astrology, you don't have the full picture. If you
right.
only use certain numbers, like some people build buildings and they skip the floor number 13, it's like, come
Yeah,
on, really?
yeah, it's crazy.
You know, this is crazy that we believe certain mythologies purposely put in place because when you leave out a certain number system, then what you're doing is you're leaving out the complete picture. And if you're trying to calculate or do something based on half a portion of a picture, you will never get the right answer. And that was the point. That is
Right,
the
right.
to
Exactly.
create fear around some of the most important pieces that we're supposed to embrace. But if we create fear, then the typical person would leave it out. And so if you leave it
Right.
out, they'll never come to the right answer. And that's
Right. And you
true.
yeah, and you made a great you used a great example there when you mentioned the number 13, okay? Because you know, the only reason 13 has become associated with bad luck is because of the Catholic Church tirade against the Knights Templar, right? And
Right.
the Pope put out a papal bull that said we need to get rid of all these Knights Templar because he didn't like the fact that they were spreading esoteric knowledge, which actually told people how the universe really works, rather than how
Mhm.
the Catholic Church was telling them it worked, you know, and that's going to diminish the power of the church. So we put out this program against the Knights Templar, and a lot of them were slaughtered on Friday the 13th, right? So it became associated with bad luck. But of course, the number 13 is a really, really fortuitous number. It's the
It's
number of
fortuitous.
Christ and the 12 disciples. It's the number of the zodiac with this you in the center and the 12 signs, right? It's all about good stuff.
There's a lot of it's a sacred number for the indigenous people.
Yeah.
So this idea that we associate, and then I'll tell you now that most people wouldn't even understand that it's associated with the Knights Templar and the Catholic Church. They just know it was bad luck. They adapted that information without ever doing the homework and then live by it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you don't get anything from this podcast as a takeaway, then please take away this. Question everything.
Question everything. Yeah. Amen.
Question everything. Question everything.
Especially what we're telling you. You know, I always told that to my kids. I always said to my kids, question everything, especially what I tell you. And I lived to regret it, you know, because now they don't believe anything I tell them, you know. They say they
I love it.
no,
I
but it's
love it.
seriously, it's very important that we question
It's
everything. Yes.
very important. And you know, I know that we have to end this at a certain point because we've been going for like an hour and a half. But
Oh, wow. Okay.
one thing that I want to basically leave with, because I want to get to that place where the reason why we had this conversation is that when you understand the trivium and quadrivium, when you've taken the time and the totality of all of it, what that opens you up for. And it opens you up for bringing in that wisdom that isn't necessarily understood without the intellect.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a balance, and intellect is not wisdom, and wisdom is not intellect. You have to have
No.
the intellect to understand and see and grasp and receive the wisdom. And if
Right.
you don't take the time to exercise the muscle called the brain.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to truly exercise it, you are going to be lost. And then you go, I don't understand it. I'm going to leave it to other people. And when you leave it to other people, those people who do grasp it and those people who do understand it, you will be following exactly what they say do because you have not taken the time.
Right, and those people would typically attempt to divide and conquer you, like they did when they split astronomy and astrology apart, and they get all the astrologers arguing with the astronomers, and the astronomers ridiculing the astrologers, and everyone, and then the astrologers arguing about which astrology is best. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. So don't fall for that crap, the divide and conquer crap. You know.
Yeah.
So if we're going to end it, Enolia, I would like to propose something.
Yes.
So I think we've been talking about, you know, using our own minds and our own critical thinking and our own reason. So we don't just take what other people tell us, okay? Now, you probably know I have a thing called 10, not 7, yeah?
Yes.
Right. So in the universe,
put it in perspective to 10, not 7 what, so that the audience knows what we're talking about.
Okay, so my hypothesis is, and by the way, I think you know some publishers, right? Because I would like to write a book about this.
Okay.
So we can talk about that. But just for copyright reasons, okay, this is Litmus A. Freeman, copyright 13525 UCC 2024 Gregorian.
Yeah.
Yeah, my 10, not 7. During Kali Yuga, a lot of the higher age thinking is lost, okay? And it becomes very base competitive warrior like, and people try to hoard knowledge, and you know, because knowledge is power. Then if you know how the universe works, you can use it to manipulate people. And if they don't know how it works, they can be easily manipulated. Now, typically things through Kali Yuga were always in 7s. But of course, there typically isn't 7, there's 10. So as we know, if we take astrology as an example, we got 7 days of the week and all of this rubbish because, you know, it's for the sun and the moon and the 5 visible planets. But we know there's not the sun and the moon and 5 visible planets. If you put all the planets in, there's 10. There's the sun and moon and 8 planets. So there's actually 10. So we should have a 10-day week, not a 7-day week. So in my Universal Celestial Calendar, which I created in 2012, I have a 10-day week. And I found out, it's called the Deacon, and I found out that the French Revolutionary calendar had this for a while after the French Revolution. But more importantly, the ancient Egyptians, who were way back up here in the silver and golden ages of consciousness, they had a 10-day week called a decad. So that's telling you, you know, there should be 10, not 7, and we can apply this to all sorts of things. So one of the things I propose is that with the Trivium and Quadrivium, we don't stick with the 7. We widen it to 10. Okay, so you know, the Trivium and Quadrivium has been handed down from Kali Yuga, and that's why there's only 7 in there. But we know that arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy isn't the full picture. And if we're thinking of ancient Greece, how can we leave out Greek mythology? How can that not be in there? How can Greek philosophy not be in there? So I'm proposing that we expand the Trivium and the Quadrivium from 7 to 10, and we'll come up with a new name for it called the Decdidium or something, I don't know, whatever. And we add in number 8, what I'm calling mythstory. Okay, so this is history and mythology, and it's the study of historical facts through mythology. So the Greek myths and what the allegory of that really means and how things work. And number 9, philosophy. which I think is cool because that goes with the ninth house in astrology, which is about philosophy. And then number 10, all the science, so the physics and the metaphysics. And that's what I think we should expand this field of study to, so that we don't just stick with 7, but we look at all 10. Okay. So that's here we are. You heard it here first. Exclusive. So
Thank
let's
you so
please someone
much.
publish my book and we'll get it out there.
I absolutely love it. So I hate to end this because it's been a wonderful conversation. You've
Yeah,
been
as
listening
always.
to Litmus A. Freeman, and how can they reach you if they want to reach out to you?
Okay, well, I don't, for the reason of bots and spam and all of this stuff, I don't put contact details in the public domain online.
Okay.
But I do have one email address on one of my websites, which is spelled out, without the actual address. But it's um, if you go to my wisdomworkouts.net website, you'll see there's an email address spelled out there, so you can get me there, or you can get me on Twitter. Oh, sorry, Twitter. What used to be Twitter, which I always call Twitter, but there we are. It's just my sense of humor. So that's now called X. I have recently set up an account on X, which is at Litmus A Freeman. So you can get me on there, or on any of my websites, which you can get through litmusafreeman.net. They're all
Okay.
linked there. And thank you very much again, Enoli. It's been wonderful. Look
Thank you
forward to
so
the
much.
next one.
Yes. Thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation. And I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. This has been about the Trivium, Quadrivium, as those are new terms to you. We have just introduced something to you that's new. Please, please, please take the time, listen, learn, and join us in that thirst for knowledge and understanding and wisdom and intellect that comes all with it. So, this has been another episode of The Infinite Way, where spirituality meets humanity. If you liked what you saw, please like us. Please subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Share this episode. Share this episode, not because it's the infinite way, but share this episode because it's time for people to wake up and to know about higher learning, and that the accessibility to it is not something that can't be grasped into the fullest of your heart. So share, 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 share. Teach, listen, and learn. Thank you again, and thank you, Litmus.
Peace, love, and freedom.
And we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye for now.
Ciao.